Saigō Takamori, was once hailed as the embodiment of honor, yet labeled a dangerous rebel when he defied his own government. Generations later, he's revered as a national icon. Just the mention of his name conjures images of a proud warrior standing against overwhelming odds. But beyond the popular nickname that history and pop culture attached to him, who was Saigō Takamori? And how did he become an enduring symbol of Japan's struggle between tradition and progress? This is the real story, twisted by myth, clouded by rumor, and still fiercely debated well over a century after his death. Samurai society was already in turmoil when Saigō was born in the early 19th century. Japan sat on the brink of monumental change, unaware that within a few decades, emperors would swap ornate robes for Western suits. Centuries-old castles would make way for modern cities, and the samurai class itself would vanish into the pages of history. Caught in that seismic shift was Saigō Takamori, a man whose determination outlasted the old regime. Yet it also propelled him toward a tragic clash with the new order he once helped create. From loyalty and betrayal to redemption and unexpected heroism, his story shakes up the tidy tales we often hear about Japan's modernization. So how does one man rise from relative obscurity to become the face of an entire era? And how did he earn both adoration and condemnation, even from the same people? The answers lie in the tumultuous era known as the Meiji Restoration, the fierce Satsuma rebellion, and the swirling mysteries around his final hours. Stay with me, because once we unravel the layers of his journey, you might see Japan's history, and perhaps even the idea of a national identity, in a completely different light. Saigō Takamori was born in 1828 in the Satsuma domain, part of present-day Kagoshima Prefecture. Unlike many revered samurai icons, he didn't emerge from an elite aristocratic line. Instead, he hailed from a modestly ranked samurai family who served the local daimyo. Yet even from an early age, Saigō's unwavering sense of loyalty and ethics caught the attention of his mentors. Stories from his childhood describe him as someone who wore his heart on his sleeve, never hesitating to speak out if he sensed an injustice. This willingness to challenge the status quo would foreshadow the dramatic role he'd play decades later. But it wasn't just moral conviction that set Saigō apart. Friends and rivals alike marveled at his natural charisma. He had a knack for bringing people together, especially during tense standoffs that could have turned violent. It's said that early on, some in Satsuma's leadership saw potential in him, dispatching him on sensitive missions that required shrewd negotiation and a steady hand. Over time, he would climb the ranks, eventually finding himself at the center of political upheaval on a national scale. Though he embraced samurai traditions like swordsmanship and Confucian ideals of loyalty, Saigō also possessed a curious mind. Rumor has it, he privately studied Western books on governance and military strategy, fascinated by how those ideas might strengthen Japan. Scholars debate how deeply he believed in modernizing the nation. Some suggest he was only interested in borrowing the West's military tactics while clinging to Japan's core traditions. Others argue he was more forward-thinking than many realize, but he simply wanted modernization to unfold in a way that preserved the dignity of the samurai class. That subtle tension, progressive outlook balanced by unwavering reverence for samurai values, would define much of Saigō's life. In the decades ahead, as Japan confronted internal and external threats, Saigō would find his loyalty torn between the emperor he served and the old customs he cherished. But before he could fully grapple with that dilemma, a momentous period of upheaval swept across the country, changing everything: transition. Yet Saigō's rise from local troubleshooter to national figure was no accident. Japan itself was entering a new epoch. and those who could adapt or oppose would either share in its transformation or be swept aside. For centuries, Japan had operated under a feudal system led by the Tokugawa shogunate. Samurai served the local lords, known as daimyo, who controlled regional domains. By the mid-19th century, though, Western powers were knocking at Japan's door, demanding trade and threatening invasion if negotiations failed. In 1853, the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry's Black Ships signaled an abrupt end to Japan's policy of near-total isolation. Faced with the possibility of foreign dominance, the country teetered on the brink of chaos. It was in this charged atmosphere that various factions, including the domains of Satsuma, Saigō's homeland, and Choshu, started aligning themselves with the imperial court in Kyoto. They aimed to overthrow the shogunate and restore the emperor to direct power. Saigō found himself at the heart of these conspiracies. His skill in negotiation, combined with his reputation for unyielding loyalty to the emperor, made him a go-to representative for Satsuma. He played critical roles in forging alliances, gathering intelligence, and even advising on military strategy. But if you think Saigō was merely a behind-the-scenes figure, think again. In 1867, the shogunate collapsed under pressure from pro-imperial forces. By 1868, Emperor Meiji was officially restored to power, though the real story was more complex. In practice, the new government was largely controlled by reform-minded samurai who were determined to modernize Japan at breakneck speed. Western dress codes, new forms of currency, railway systems, telegraphs, all of it flooded in at a pace few could have imagined. Saigō, initially part of this pro-imperial alliance, supported reforms intended to strengthen Japan against foreign threats. But controversies soon emerged. The new leaders enacted sweeping measures that effectively dismantled the samurai class, banning the wearing of swords in public, eliminating hereditary stipends, and promoting a Western-style conscript army that made traditional samurai martial arts seem obsolete. Some claim that, behind closed doors, Saigō grumbled about the unrelenting pace of change. He wasn't against modernization in principle. He was outraged by the way it trampled on centuries of cultural heritage. Tensions reached a boiling point when the Meiji government, eager to cement its authority, made decisions without consulting influential samurai from regions like Satsuma. Talk of corruption, nepotism, and hidden deals circulated. In the eyes of many loyal samurai, the government's methods betrayed the very spirit of the emperor they had fought to restore. Saigō faced a painful choice: support the fledgling Meiji regime he had helped bring to power, or defend the old samurai code he cherished. Transition. Feeling that the heart of Japan was being dismantled by the very regime he had helped establish, Saigō set his sights on an open challenge, one that would plunge the country into a civil war and forever cement his reputation as both a rebel and a hero. By 1877, Saigō Takamori could no longer ignore the widening gulf between the government's westernizing agenda and the lingering values of the samurai class. Having resigned from his high-ranking government posts in protest, he retreated to his native Satsuma. There, he established private academies that championed loyalty, martial arts, and a traditional sense of honor. These schools drew thousands of disaffected samurai from all over Japan, men who felt cast aside by the new system and yearned for a leader to restore their dignity. At first, it wasn't a formal rebellion. Saigō seemed to be holding out hope that the Meiji government would slow its reforms and honor the contributions of the samurai. But rumors began circulating that Tokyo officials were plotting to arrest him. Fueled by anger and fear, samurai in Satsuma demanded Saigō take action. Tension escalated rapidly, and in January 1877, open conflict exploded. Saigō led his followers northward toward Kumamoto, hoping to gather support along the way and convinced local garrisons to join his cause. But the rebellion quickly met fierce resistance from the imperial army, now armed with modern rifles, artillery, and Western military training. Saigō's traditional swordsmen, though courageous, were ill-equipped to face such firepower. The initial months of the conflict saw some success for the rebels, who captured small outposts and stockpiles of weapons. Yet the odds were stacked against them. Government forces had the advantage in both numbers and technology, and they surrounded Saigō's troops. Controversy swirled around this time. Some historical records suggest Saigō wasn't entirely convinced the rebellion would succeed, but pressed forward out of a sense of duty to his supporters. Others claim he truly believed in a righteous cause, to redeem the emperor from the clutches of corrupt officials who were supposedly betraying Japan's essence. Whichever version you believe, one thing is certain. The clash between the old and new ways had reached a point of no return. A dramatic rumor from this era mentions that certain powerful figures in Tokyo actually sympathized with Saigō's ideals. Some say there were clandestine meetings aimed at negotiating a compromise, but these efforts broke down. Another rumor insists that a secret faction in the government actively sabotaged any peace talks, determined to eliminate the samurai threat once and for all. Whether these rumors hold any truth remains uncertain, but they highlight the chaotic backdrop against which Saigō fought. The Satsuma rebellion wasn't just about swords versus guns. It was a deeper struggle over how Japan should integrate new ideas without sacrificing its cultural core. And at the center of it all stood Saigō, a towering figure in both a literal and metaphorical sense. He was known to be physically imposing, but it was his moral stature that inspired thousands to stand beside him, even when victory seemed impossible. As government forces closed in on the rebels, Saigō made a fateful decision to keep fighting to the bitter end rather than surrender. It was a choice that led him to a final showdown at Shiroyama, one that would seal his destiny and cement his place in Japanese lore. Shiroyama, a rugged hillside near Kagoshima, would become the stage for the last stand of Saigō Takamori and his remaining followers. By September 1877, the rebellion had been all but crushed. Exhausted, outnumbered, and short on ammunition, the rebels dug in for a final defensive stance. Government troops, equipped with modern weaponry and guided by advisors who had studied Western military tactics, surrounded the area in an overwhelming display of force. The battle began in the early morning hours of September 24th, 1877. Cannons roared, lighting up the night sky. Reports say that the Imperial Army fired tens of thousands of rounds, slowly but relentlessly closing in on Saigō's position. The rebels, fiercely committed, kept fighting even as their lines dwindled. Witness accounts describe a scene of harrowing courage, with men rushing into gunfire armed only with swords or outdated rifles. It was a testament to their unbreakable spirit and their likely understanding that surrender would betray everything they stood for. Then came the moment that has become a focal point of so much debate. According to traditional accounts, Saigō was gravely wounded in the hip or thigh, rendering him unable to continue fighting. Unwilling to be captured, he allegedly asked a comrade to help him end his life. In the centuries-old samurai practice, this would have been considered an honorable fate. Better to die by one's own blade than fall into enemy hands. The story goes that Saigō was taken behind the lines, where he offed himself to preserve his honor. Yet rumors persist that the reality wasn't so clear-cut. Some argue that Saigō died outright from gunfire on the battlefield, negating any chance of a ritual end. Others claim the government staged a cover-up, preferring the narrative that Saigō chose a noble death rather than reveal the gruesome possibility that he was simply felled by modern weaponry. One more extreme theory insists he wasn't killed at all, that he escaped with a handful of loyalists and lived in secrecy to avoid further civil strife. While mainstream historians typically dismiss that last rumor, its very existence shows how deeply people want to keep the legend alive. What's undeniable is that by the end of that day, the Satsuma rebellion was over. The imperial army methodically mopped up pockets of resistance, marking a decisive victory for the Meiji government. It also underscored that the era of the samurai, at least in the traditional sense, was done. But in defeating Saigō, had the government destroyed an obstacle to progress, or had it severed a vital link to Japan's cultural soul? That debate continues to simmer. Even in death, Saigō remained a controversial figure. But in a twist no one expected, the same government that crushed his rebellion would soon elevate him to the status of a national icon. How exactly does a traitor become a beloved hero of the empire he once fought? Not long after the rebellion ended, Emperor Meiji granted a special pardon to Saigō Takamori. On the surface, it seemed baffling. The man had led an armed insurgency against the state and lost. Yet many believe the emperor himself, or at least key advisors, recognized Saigō's unwavering devotion to what he believed was in the best interest of Japan. By pardoning him, the government effectively transformed a fallen rebel into a posthumous hero. From that point on, Saigō's legend only grew. Statues bearing his likeness began to appear, the most famous of which stands in Tokyo's Ueno Park, depicting him in a casual kimono walking his dog. This statue became a pilgrimage site for admirers, a place where they could honor the man who had once been labeled an enemy. His image started appearing in woodblock prints, books, and even folk songs that hailed him as the defender of a vanishing spirit of honor. This shift from vilified rebel to esteemed hero was more than mere propaganda. It reflected a complex national sentiment. Many in Japan realized that the modernization drive, while beneficial in some respects, had come with a steep cultural price. By portraying Saigō as a sincere patriot whose only sin was adhering too closely to samurai values, the nation found a figure who symbolized both the sorrow of letting go of the past and the dignity inherent in those old ways. However, not everyone saw him as a virtuous icon. Detractors pointed out that the Satsuma rebellion caused considerable loss of life, including civilians caught in the crossfire. They argued that Saigō's refusal to compromise plunged Japan into a brutal conflict at a fragile juncture. Others insisted that the new Meiji leadership had no choice but to quell the rebellion if Japan were to stand strong against Western powers. This clash of perspectives turned Saigō's legacy into a mirror reflecting both Japan's nostalgia for tradition and its need to move forward. In time, the notion of Saigō as the last samurai gained currency in popular discourse. Though ironically, he was not literally the last samurai alive. Countless individuals of samurai descent continued to serve in various roles, some transitioning into the new conscript army, others joining government or business sectors. But as a symbol, Saigō embodied the end of an era. His story, caught between feudal loyalty and modern nationalism, resonated deeply, reminding people that history isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a knot of conflicting values, power struggles, and personal convictions that refuse easy resolution. With his legend firmly in place, you might assume the story ends. Yet, new questions and controversies continued to surface, fueled by newly discovered documents, shifting academic perspectives, and a public that never stopped wondering. Was Saigō Takamori truly the hero we've been told? Or did his myth overshadow a far more complicated reality? As decades passed, historians began digging into the archives, unearthing letters and diaries that shed fresh light on Saigō Takamori's motivations. Some suggest he was even more politically savvy than previously acknowledged, using the banner of tradition to mask deeper ambitions for reform on his own terms. Others propose that Saigō had a grand vision of a Japan that balanced Eastern ethics with Western innovation. If that's true, then his rebellion might not have been a rejection of modernization at all. It might have been a cry for a more measured approach. Controversies also emerge around the question of his final moments. Official government accounts claim he died honorably, though not every witness agrees. Over the years, rumor mills have speculated that the government sanitized the truth, because admitting that their fearsome foe had fallen in a more mundane or inglorious way could have sparked lingering resentment among his supporters. A romanticized last stand might have been seen as a way to grant Saigō's death and the entire samurai era a noble send-off, thus facilitating national unity in the aftermath. Meanwhile, in Japan's cultural consciousness, Saigō appears everywhere, from school textbooks to popular media. He's invoked during political discussions about integrity, often cast as the last man who truly stood for moral values and governance. Scholars frequently debate whether we should view him primarily as a patriot, a romantic figure clinging to a bygone era, or simply a military strategist who miscalculated his chances. Certain new findings even highlight tensions between Saigō and other samurai leaders, hinting that behind the scenes, his rebellion was not as unified as many assume. Personal grudges, domain rivalries, and old feuds might have played bigger roles than once believed. Modern controversies also swirl around the extent to which Saigō was responsible for the violence of the Satsuma rebellion. Did he do enough to prevent civilian casualties? Did he truly believe the emperor would support him if he marched on Tokyo? These questions ignite intense debates in academic circles, with no clear consensus in sight. The Japanese media, too, returns to the topic every few years, especially when new documents or anniversaries surface. Some TV programs glorify him as an idol of moral rectitude. Others emphasize the chaos and bloodshed the rebellion unleashed, cautioning against idolizing what they see as a regressive stand. This ongoing interest shows that Saigō's legacy still resonates in a Japan that continues to juggle tradition and modernization. The country has changed drastically since the 19th century, yet the tension between preserving cultural identity and embracing global influence remains a potent topic. Now that we've examined Saigō's rise, his final stand, and the swirling debates that continue to shape his legend, how do we make sense of it all? Perhaps it's time to look at the bigger picture, how one man's life can capture the essence of an entire civilization's struggle with the future. From his humble beginnings in the Satsuma domain to the heights of political power in the early Meiji government, and finally to the smoking battlefield of Shiroyama, Saigō Takamori's life traced the arc of a Japan in transition. He stood at the crossroads where feudal loyalty collided with the demands of a new era, torn between his devotion to the emperor and his belief in preserving the soul of the samurai way. In choosing defiance, he ignited a rebellion that ultimately confirmed the Meiji government's power and sealed the fate of the old samurai order. Ultimately, Saigō's legacy stands as a warning and a beacon. It warns us that rapid change can fracture a society if it fails to honor the bonds that brought it there in the first place. It also beacons us to remember that even in defeat, a powerful idea can shape the hearts of future generations. Whether we call him the last samurai or simply Saigō Takamori, his life reminds us that one individual's passion can crystallize an entire era's hopes and fears. And if that isn't a reason to keep talking about him, debating his motives, and uncovering new facets of his tale, then maybe nothing else could be. In the end, Saigō Takamori's story isn't just about a war or a rebellion. It's about a nation wrestling with its identity at a crossroads in history. And that makes it a story with resonance far beyond 19th century Japan. one that speaks to anyone who has ever felt their world shift beneath them as new ways collide with old beliefs. Perhaps that's why his memory persists, as vibrant now as it was in his lifetime, still daring us to consider what we might sacrifice or preserve when our own moment of transformation arrives.